The quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. Families walked their dogs along the tree-lined streets, children played basketball in driveways, and neighbors exchanged polite nods as they watered their lawns. It was a peaceful, predictable world until one chilling afternoon shattered that illusion. The boy's scream tore through the air like a siren, cutting through the gentle hum of the neighborhood. "My neighbor watches me." His voice, high-pitched and panicked, sent chills down the spine of anyone within earshot. Mrs. Howard, who was trimming her rose bushes nearby, froze mid-snip. Mr. Jenkins, adjusting his sprinkler across the street, dropped his wrench. People stepped out onto their porches, looking toward the source of the commotion. The boy, around 10 years old, stood trembling on the sidewalk, his wide eyes darting back toward the house across the street. His name was Ethan, a quiet kid who rarely caused a stir. But today, there was no mistaking the fear etched into his face. His little hands clutched his backpack as if it could shield him from the invisible threat. Within minutes, the police arrived, their patrol car lights flashing red and blue against the otherwise serene backdrop. Officer Martinez, a seasoned member of the force, stepped out of the car, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. "Who called this in?" she asked, her voice calm but authoritative. Mrs. Howard raised a trembling hand. "It was Ethan," he said. "He said something about his neighbor watching him. He's been acting scared lately, but I never thought." Her words trailed off, a nervous glance toward the house in question. Ethan's neighbor, Mr. Grayson, was a man of few words. In his late 40s, he lived alone in the slightly run-down house on the corner. The neighborhood whispered about him occasionally, how he rarely joined community events, how his curtains were always drawn tight, and how he seemed to watch people through the slats. But whispers were just that, idle talk without substance. At least, that's what everyone thought. Officer Martinez crouched down to Ethan's level. "Hey there, buddy. Can you tell me what happened? Why do you think your neighbor is watching you?" Ethan hesitated, his bottom lip quivering. He glanced at the house again, as if expecting to see eyes peeking through the curtains. I feel like he's always looking at me. I see his shadow sometimes when I walk by. And last night, I heard something. It came from his window, a voice. It said my name." A collective shiver ran through the growing crowd of neighbors. Martinez exchanged a glance with her partner, Officer Decker, who was already jotting notes in his small notebook. The story was strange, but the boy's fear was real. And in situations like this, you couldn't afford to dismiss a child's instincts. "We're going to check it out, okay?" Martinez assured Ethan. "You're safe now. We'll figure out what's going on." The officers made their way toward Mr. Grayson's house, the crowd watching with bated breath. Martinez knocked firmly on the door. "Mr. Grayson, this is the police. Can you come to the door, please?" No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. "Mr. Grayson, we need to speak with you." Still nothing. Decker tried the doorknob. It was locked, but not unusual for someone living alone. "We'll need to get a warrant," he said under his breath. Before they could turn to leave, a sound from inside stopped them. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A low, muffled noise, like someone crying out, or trying not to. Martinez and Decker exchanged looks. This wasn't something they could ignore. With the neighbors watching anxiously from a distance, the officers decided to act. Decker radioed for backup while Martinez circled the house, looking for another way in. A window at the back of the house was slightly ajar. She peered inside, but couldn't see much through the heavy curtains. What they found inside the house would leave the entire neighborhood in shock and raise more questions than answers. But for now, no one could have predicted the dark secrets waiting to be uncovered behind Mr. Grayson's closed doors. Officer Martinez stood at the back of the house, the faint noise she'd heard moments earlier still ringing in her ears. She signaled to Decker, who joined her quickly, their communication now wordless, but perfectly in sync. The sound hadn't come again, but something in the stillness felt heavy, oppressive. Martinez's instincts, honed from years on the force, told her this wasn't just a case of a boy's overactive imagination. "Back window's cracked," she whispered. "We need eyes inside." Decker nodded, pulling out his flashlight. They couldn't force their way in without a warrant, not without immediate danger to someone inside, but the faint noise had been enough for them to check further. "Careful," Decker said as Martinez carefully tested the window. It slid open with a soft creak, revealing a dimly lit room inside. Peering through the gap, Martinez could make out what looked like a living room, cluttered, but not overly so. Old furniture, mismatched lamps, and shelves packed with books lined the space. It looked normal at first glance, but something felt off. She noticed thick blackout curtains on all the windows, the air inside the house stale, as if it hadn't been aired out in weeks. Meanwhile, the neighbors continued to gather on the sidewalk, whispering among themselves. Ethan sat on the curb, next to Mrs. Howard, clutching her hand tightly. He hadn't said much after his initial outburst, but his gaze never left Mr. Grayson's house. His young face was pale, his expression distant, as though reliving whatever had brought him to this breaking point. "Do you think they'll find something?" Mrs. Howard asked quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Grayson's strange, sure, but... "He's more than strange," a voice interrupted. It was Mr. Jenkins, the man from across the street. His normally cheerful demeanor was gone, replaced by a somber expression. "I've seen him at night, standing by his window just staring, and not at anything in particular. Just out there, like he's waiting for something." Another neighbor chimed in. "He's been here for years, hasn't he? Moved in after his wife left him. Never really spoke to anyone." "But he's harmless, isn't he?" someone else asked nervously. "I mean, he's a little odd, sure, but he's never caused trouble before." Ethan's small voice cut through the murmurs. "He watches me, every day, and at night I hear him whisper my name." The adults fell silent, a chill passing through the group. Mrs. Howard put her arm around the boy, her heart breaking at the fear in his voice. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just a coincidence, and it wasn't something they could brush off anymore. Inside the house, Martinez and Decker moved carefully, their senses heightened. They weren't technically inside yet, but they needed to get closer. Martinez leaned further into the open window, her flashlight illuminating more of the room. Something caught her eye, a stack of Polaroid photographs sitting on the coffee table. From this angle, she couldn't make out what was in the photos, but the fact that they were sitting out in the open, perfectly arranged, felt deliberate. "Do you see that?" she whispered to Decker. He nodded. "Pictures. Looks like a lot of them. Weird place to leave them, though." Before they could investigate further, the faint noise came again, this time louder. A muffled voice, almost like a whimper, coming from somewhere deeper inside the house. Martinez's heart raced as she turned back to Decker. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," he replied, his hand instinctively moving to the radio on his shoulder. "We need backup. Now." "Wait," Martinez said, holding up a hand. "We can't wait. Someone's in Mare." Decker hesitated, but he knew she was right. The sound wasn't normal. Someone could be in danger. With a nod, the two officers moved to the back door. To their surprise, it wasn't locked. Martinez glanced at Decker, who gave a brief nod, and together they pushed the door open. The smell hit them first, a mix of mildew, dust, and something faintly metallic. The house was eerily quiet now, the earlier sound gone. They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the dimness. The living room looked much the same as it had through the window, but now, up close, they could see more details. The Polaroids on the coffee table were indeed arranged in a neat stack, but what they depicted sent a chill down Martinez's spine. Children, photo after photo of children, some smiling, some playing, but all completely unaware they were being photographed. Martinez flipped through the stack, her stomach tightening. The photos were taken from a distance, through windows, over fences, and there in the middle of the stack was a photo of Ethan, walking home from school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Decker let out a low whistle. This just got a whole lot worse. "Who does this?" Martinez muttered, her voice shaking with anger. "This guy, he's been watching them. All of them." She placed the photos back on the table, careful not to disturb the evidence, and motioned for Decker to follow her. They moved deeper into the house, their footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The room was small and windowless, illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was an old wooden chair, and on the chair sat a cassette recorder, its tape spinning slowly. The sound they'd heard, the muffled voice, was coming from the tape. Martinez stepped closer, her hand hovering over the recorder as she pressed the stop button. The room fell silent. "What is this?" Decker asked, his voice low. Martinez didn't answer. Her eyes were drawn to a small desk in the corner, cluttered with notebooks, clippings, and more Polaroids. One notebook lay open, its pages filled with messy handwriting. She leaned in, scanning the words. Most of it was gibberish, disjointed thoughts, random phrases, but one line was underlined multiple times. "They know. I have to stop them before they find out." Decker's radio crackled to life, starting them both. "Backup's here," the dispatcher said. "What's the situation?" Martinez pressed the button on her shoulder. "We're inside. We found evidence, and something's not right here. We need forensics ASAP." As she spoke, the faint sound of a floorboard creaking upstairs caught their attention. Martinez and Decker froze, their eyes meeting. They weren't alone. Martinez held up a hand to silence Decker as her ears tuned in to the sound. The creak was faint but unmistakable. Someone was upstairs. Her grip tightened on her flashlight, her other hand hovering near her holstered weapon. Decker nodded silently, his expression tense but focused. The two officers moved toward the staircase, their footsteps as quiet as possible on the old wooden floors. The stairs groaned under their weight, each step feeling louder than the last in the oppressive silence of the house. Martinez's heart pounded as they reached the landing. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with closed doors. A thin strip of light seeped out from beneath the door at the far end, and the faintest shadow moved within it. Decker leaned close, whispering, "Could be him. Or someone else. Be ready." Martinez nodded, her voice low. "We clear room by room. Stay close." They started with the nearest door, finding nothing but an empty bedroom filled with dusty furniture and a stale, unwelcoming air. The next room was similar, a spare room, cluttered with boxes and forgotten belongings. But the tension didn't ease. The light under that final door seemed to grow brighter with every passing moment, and the faint shadow danced like a taunt. As they approached the last door, Martinez felt a chill run down her spine. She reached for the knob, turning it slowly. It gave with a soft click, and she pushed the door open with her flashlight extended. The room was small, with walls painted an unassuming beige. A single bed sat in the corner, its sheets neatly tucked. But what dominated the space was the desk by the window. The light came from a desk lamp, illuminating a spread of papers, photographs, and what appeared to be a map of the neighborhood. Red pins dotted various locations on the map: front yards, playgrounds, street corners. All places where children played or walked. What there Decker started, but Martinez cut him off with a sharp look. She stepped closer, her flashlight beam moving over the surface of the desk. More Polaroids were scattered across it, along with a notebook similar to the one downstairs. This one had pages filled with crude drawings of the neighborhood, complete with marked paths and notes written in shorthand. Martinez flipped through the pages, her pulse quickening as she recognized several familiar landmarks and the faces of children in the neighborhood. Decker pointed to a Polaroid pinned to the wall above the desk. "Martinez, look." The photo was of Ethan, taken from behind as he walked to school. Scrawled across the bottom in shaky handwriting were the words, *perfect target. Soon. *. Martinez felt the bile rise in her throat. This wasn't just about surveillance. This was planned, calculated. She turned to Decker, her voice barely above a whisper. This guy isn't just watching. He's hunting. Decker opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the sound of a door slamming downstairs echoed through the house. Both officers spun around, weapons drawn, adrenaline surging. Someone was definitely here, and now they were on the move. Martinez radioed for backup again, her voice firm but urgent. "We have movement inside the residence, requesting immediate assistance. Possible suspects still on site." They moved quickly, retracing their steps down the staircase. The front door was still closed, the locks intact, but a draft of cold air swept through the house as if someone had just passed by. The officers split up to check the lower floor again. Martinez moved toward the kitchen while Decker swept through the living room. As Martinez approached the back door, her flashlight caught something new, a scuff mark on the floor just inside the threshold. They took off in pursuit, their radios crackling as they coordinated with the arriving backup units. The figure ahead of them was fast, darting through the shadows like someone who knew the terrain all too well. But Martinez wasn't about to let them get away. "Stop, police," she shouted, her voice echoing in the stillness. The chase led them through a narrow path behind the row of houses, the ground uneven and treacherous. Decker stumbled but caught himself, while Martinez kept her focus on the figure ahead. They were losing ground, but then the suspect made a mistake, a sharp turn into a dead-end alley. Martinez and Decker closed in, their weapons drawn. "Hands where we can see them," Martinez commanded, her voice firm. The figure turned slowly, their face obscured by the shadows. It wasn't Mr. Grayson. It was a younger man, maybe in his late 20s, with disheveled hair and wild eyes. He raised his hands, trembling. "I didn't do anything," he cried, his voice shaking. "I swear, I don't know what's going on." "Then why were you running?" Decker demanded, moving closer to secure the man's hands behind his back. The man stammered, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. I live nearby. I saw the cops, and I got scared. I've heard things about Grayson, everyone has, but I didn't do anything, I swear." Martinez narrowed her eyes, studying him. His fear seemed genuine, but something about his story didn't sit right. "What do you know about Grayson?" she pressed. "Why were you near his house tonight?" The man hesitated, glancing nervously at the officers. "I've seen him watching people. Kids, mostly. I didn't think it was my business. But then I saw him digging in his backyard last night. He had this big tarp, and I thought." He trailed off, his eyes wide with unspoken implications. Martinez felt her stomach drop. If what this man was saying was true, the mystery was even darker than they'd feared. As backup arrived to take the man into custody for questioning, Martinez and Decker exchanged a grim look. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of a puzzle that didn't yet fit. But one thing was certain: whatever secrets Mr. Grayson was hiding, they were about to uncover something far worse than they had imagined. Martinez stood in the alley, her heart pounding as the young man was led away by the arriving officers. His words echoed in her mind. Asterisk digging in the backyard. A tarp asterisk. She exchanged a look with Decker, whose expression mirrored her own unease. Every step they had taken in this case had uncovered something darker, something more twisted. And now the shadowy figure of Mr. Grayson loomed larger than ever, an enigma wrapped in fear and suspicion. "We need to check the backyard," Martinez said, her voice firm but low. "If he's been burying something out there." Decker nodded, gripping his flashlight tighter. "Let's not wait around to find out." The two officers made their way back to the house, where the rest of their team was already beginning a full sweep of the property. Martinez directed 2 officers to secure the perimeter while she and Decker headed for the backyard. The cold night air felt heavier now, as if the house and its secrets were drawing all the warmth from the surroundings. The backyard was overgrown, the grass high and unkempt. A small garden plot near the back fence caught Martinez's attention. The soil looked freshly disturbed, dark and uneven compared to the rest of the yard. She stepped closer, her flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. Her chest tightened at the sight. There was a faint outline in the dirt, rectangular, like something had been buried there recently. Decker joined her, his face grim. This must be it. Martinez radioed for the forensic team. We've got a potential burial site in the backyard, requesting immediate assistance. As they waited, Martinez's mind raced. What could Grayson have buried here? The photos, the notebooks, the obsessive surveillance of the neighborhood. Every clue painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual. But the truth still felt just out of reach, like a shadow darting at the edge of her vision. The forensic team arrived quickly, setting up floodlights to illuminate the backyard. The bright, harsh light revealed every detail of the disturbed soil, making the scene even more unsettling. Martinez and Decker stepped back, giving the technicians room to work. The sound of shovels breaking through the dirt filled the air, each scrape adding to the tension. The crowd of neighbors had grown, their murmurs carrying across the still night. Ethan stood with Mrs. Howard, his small frame trembling as he watched the activity in the backyard. He hadn't spoken much since his initial outburst, but his wide, fearful eyes told Martinez everything she needed to know. This boy had seen or felt something that had shaken him to his core. As the digging continued, an officer approached Martinez. "We found Grayson," he said, his tone cautious. He was hiding in the crawl space under the house. Martinez's heart jumped. "And?" "He's not talking," the officer continued, "but he looks rattled, more scared than anything else." Scared. That word stuck with Martinez as she followed the officer back to the house. Grayson was sitting in the living room, handcuffed and surrounded by 2 officers. His once imposing figure seemed smaller now, his shoulders hunched and his head down. He looked up as Martinez entered, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Mr. Grayson," she began, her voice steady. "We need to know what's in your backyard. What were you digging for?" Grayson's lips trembled, but he didn't respond. His hands fidgeted in his lap, his nails bitten down to the quick. Martinez leaned in closer. "If you tell us now, it'll be better for you. We're going to find out either way." Still, he said nothing. A sudden shout from the backyard broke the tense silence. Martinez spun around, rushing outside with Decker on her heels. The forensic team had stopped digging, their faces pale under the harsh lights. Martinez's stomach churned as she approached the edge of the pit. At first, she couldn't make out what they'd uncovered. It was wrapped in layers of thick plastic, the edges stained dark with mud. One of the technicians carefully pulled the covering back, revealing a small, battered suitcase. The sight of it sent a ripple of unease through everyone present. Martinez crouched beside the suitcase, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she worked the latches. The locks were old and rusted, but they gave way with a soft asterisk click asterisk. She hesitated for a moment, then lifted the lid. Inside, neatly arranged in stacks, were dozens of photographs. Each one was a Polaroid, just like the ones they'd found inside the house. Martinez flipped through them, her breath catching in her throat. These photos were older, their colors faded with time, but the faces were unmistakable, children from the neighborhood, spanning years, maybe decades. "What is this?" Decker muttered, his voice shaking. "Why would he bury these?" Martinez didn't answer. Her eyes were drawn to the bottom of the suitcase, where a single object rested beneath the photos. It was a small, worn teddy bear, its fur matted and its button eyes missing. She picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hands. A name was stitched into the back, *Lila*. Lila. Martinez whispered to herself. The name wasn't familiar, but it felt significant. She looked up at Decker. "We need to run this name through the system, and we need to dig deeper. There's more to this." Before Decker could respond, another shout came from the edge of the yard. One of the officers pointed toward the house. Grayson had bolted, breaking free from his captors and disappearing into the dark. Martinez and Decker didn't hesitate. They took off after him, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they navigated the shadows. Grayson was fast for his age, his desperation driving him forward. He weaved through the narrow alleys and side streets, his movements erratic but determined. "Stop," Martinez shouted, her voice cutting through the night. But Grayson didn't stop. He rounded a corner, disappearing from view. When Martinez and Decker caught up, they found themselves in an empty playground. The swings creaked in the wind, their rusty chains swaying gently. Grayson stood in the center of the playground, his hands raised in surrender. But his face wasn't one of defeat, it was one of terror. He looked past Martinez and Decker, his eyes fixed on something neither of them could see. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You don't understand. I was protecting them. I was trying to stop it." "Protecting who?" Martinez demanded, her gun trained on him. "What are you talking about?" Grayson shook his head, backing away. "It's too late. You've let them in." Before Martinez could press him further, a sharp crack echoed through the air, a sound that wasn't quite natural. The lights around the playground flickered, plunging the area into brief darkness. When they came back on, Grayson was gone. Martinez stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. Decker stared at her, his expression mirroring her own disbelief. Whatever was happening, it was far from over, and the answers they sought felt further away than ever. Martinez's grip on her flashlight tightened as the eerie silence of the playground pressed down on her. Grayson's sudden disappearance felt impossible. There had been no time for him to escape so cleanly. Decker stood beside her, his gaze darting around the shadows that seemed to grow deeper with every flicker of the failing lights. Neither of them spoke, the weight of the moment leaving an unspoken understanding that something was deeply, profoundly wrong. "What just happened?" Decker finally whispered, his voice barely audible, as if speaking louder might provoke the unseen. Martinez shook her head, her pulse racing. "I don't know, but he couldn't have gone far. Start searching. He's not getting away again." Decker nodded, and they split up to scan the playground and the surrounding area. Martinez moved toward the swing set, her flashlight beam cutting through the mist that had begun to gather, thick and heavy. The swings creaked with a rhythmic squeak, swaying faintly as if disturbed by a phantom wind. Her gut told her to stay alert, but every logical part of her brain fought to make sense of what had just unfolded. As she passed the slide, her radio crackled to life, making her jump. It was one of the officers back at the house. "Detective Martinez, we've got something here you need to see. It's urgent." "What is it?" She responded quickly, her voice sharper than she intended. "We're in the middle of tracking Grayson." There was a pause, and the officer's voice came back, filled with hesitation. "Ma'am, the files we pulled from the suitcase. There's a name that keeps coming up. Lila Carter. We did a search. She's been missing for nearly 20 years. Martinez's stomach dropped. The teddy bear. The name stitched onto it suddenly carried a weight that made her hands tremble. "A missing person. From here?" "Yes, ma'am. She was reported missing from this very neighborhood when she was 8 years old. The case was never solved, and her body was never found. Grayson would have been living here at the time." Martinez turned back toward Decker, her voice tight as she replied into the radio. "Keep digging. I want every detail about that case. We'll head back once we've cleared this area." But before she could take another step, Decker's voice rang out from across the playground. "Martinez, over here." She sprinted toward the sound, her flashlight bouncing wildly with every stride. Decker was standing near a cluster of overgrown bushes on the edge of the playground, his flashlight trained on something just beyond the foliage. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. "What is it?" Martinez asked, her voice breathless. Decker pointed with a shaky hand. There, etched into the bark of an old oak tree, was a single name. Asterisk Lila asterisk beneath, it was a series of crude tally marks, 20, maybe more. Martinez's heart sank as she realized they looked fresh, the edges of the carvings clean and unweathered. That wasn't here before, Decker muttered, his voice thick with unease. I'm sure of it. Martinez reached out to touch the carving, her gloved fingers tracing the name as if the act might bring her closer to understanding. But as her fingertips brushed the bark, a strange sensation washed over her, a cold, sinking feeling that made her pull back sharply. We need to get back to the house, she said, her voice firm but laced with a growing sense of urgency. Something's not adding up. As they made their way back, the neighborhood seemed to close in around them. Shadows stretched unnaturally long under the flickering streetlights, and the faint hum of night sounds felt muted, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Martinez couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against her back. When they arrived at Grayson's house, the scene was chaos. Officers were combing through the property, forensic technicians were packing up evidence, and a cluster of neighbors had gathered at the edge of the street, their whispers and speculation growing louder with each passing minute. Mrs. Howard stood at the edge of the crowd, her arms wrapped protectively around Ethan, who looked even smaller under the harsh glow of the floodlights. Martinez approached the lead forensic technician, her voice steady but demanding. What else have you found? The technician hesitated, glancing around as if unsure whether to speak in front of the gathered crowd. Finally, he leaned in, lowering his voice. There's more than just photos in that suitcase. There are notes, detailed accounts of children in the neighborhood. Dates, times, descriptions. It's like he was keeping a log. And the missing girl, Lila Carter, Martinez pressed. The technician nodded grimly. There are references to her, but nothing conclusive. Just mentions of her name and, he hesitated again, clearly struggling with his next words. There's a sketch in the notebook. It looks like her. Martinez felt the air leave her lungs. She turned to Decker, who looked just as shaken. This changes everything, she said quietly. Grayson isn't just some creep with a camera. He's been at this for decades. And if he's tied to Lila's disappearance... Her words trailed off as another officer approached, his face pale. Detectives, you need to see this. It's in the basement. Martinez and Decker followed the officer back into the house, down the creaking stairs to the basement. The air grew colder with every step, and the dim light from the single bulb overhead did little to dispel the oppressive darkness. At the far end of the basement was a large metal cabinet, its doors slightly ajar. The officer gestured to it, stepping back as if he didn't want to get any closer. Martinez opened the doors fully, her flashlight illuminating the contents inside. Rows of VHS tapes filled the shelves, each one labeled with dates spanning back years. A small, dusty television sat nearby, connected to an old VCR. Martinez exchanged a look with Decker before loading one of the tapes into the machine. The screen flickered to life, displaying grainy footage of a backyard. It was Grayson's backyard, unmistakably, but the images were old, the colors washed out. The camera focused on a group of children playing, their laughter faint but audible through the crackling audio. Then, the camera zoomed in on one child in particular, a little girl with dark curls and a bright smile. She turned toward the camera, oblivious to its presence. The date in the corner of the screen sent a chill down Martinez's spine. It matched the year Lila Carter disappeared. Decker's voice was barely above a whisper. He's been watching them all along. Martinez swallowed hard, her thoughts racing. The tapes, the photos, the notebooks, it was all part of a sick, meticulous pattern. And now Grayson was out there somewhere, running from the truth they were unraveling. But there was still so much they didn't know. Why had he carved Lila's name into the tree? And what did he mean when he said he was protecting them? Martinez could feel the answers lurking just out of reach, their weight growing heavier with every passing moment. But one thing was clear: the deeper they dug, the darker the truth became. Martinez stared at the flickering screen, her pulse hammering in her ears. The sight of Lila's bright smile, frozen forever in grainy footage, felt like a punch to the gut. There was no doubt now. Grayson had been watching her, just as he'd watched Ethan and the countless other children who had lived in this neighborhood over the years. But why? And what was he trying to protect them from? Those unanswered questions gnawed at her, demanding resolution. Decker broke the silence, his voice tight. "We need to track him down. He's running, but he knows we're onto him. If he's been doing this for decades, he won't let this end quietly." Martinez nodded, pulling herself together. "Send out an alert. All units in the area need to be looking for him. And I want those tapes catalogued. They could hold the answers we're missing." As the officers dispersed to carry out her orders, Martinez stepped outside, needing a moment to collect her thoughts. The crowd of neighbors had thinned, but Mrs. Howard and Ethan remained, watching her with anxious eyes. Ethan's small voice broke the heavy silence. "Did you find him, Mr. Grayson?" Martinez crouched down to his level, trying to offer reassurance despite the storm raging inside her. "We're working on it, Ethan. You're safe now. We'll figure this out." But Ethan didn't look comforted. Instead, his expression grew more troubled. "You have to stop him," he whispered. "He said they were coming for me. He said I was next." Those words sent a chill down Martinez's spine. "Who, Ethan? Who's coming for you?" Ethan shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know. He said they don't stop. That's why he watches, to keep them away." Before Martinez could press further, her radio crackled with an urgent update. "Detective Martinez, we've got a sighting. Grayson's been spotted heading toward the old community center on Elm Street." She stood quickly, her heart racing. "On our way." The community center had been abandoned for years, a crumbling relic of the neighborhood's past. Martinez and Decker arrived with their weapons drawn, the eerie silence of the building amplifying every sound. The faint scuff of their boots echoed as they made their way inside, flashlights cutting through the darkness. They found Grayson in the main hall, hunched over a table cluttered with papers and old photographs. He didn't flinch when they entered, his shoulders sagging as though he had been expecting them. "Mr. Grayson," Martinez called out, her voice firm. "It's over. Put your hands where we can see them." Grayson slowly raised his hands, but didn't turn around. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "I wasn't the one hurting them. I was trying to keep them safe." Martinez stepped closer, her gun steady. "From what? What were you protecting them from?" He finally turned to face her, his eyes hollow and haunted. "From them. They've always been here, in the shadows." Martinez exchanged a glance with Decker, her mind racing. Was this some desperate attempt to deflect blame, or was there something deeper at play? She kept her focus on Grayson. "You're not making sense. Who are they?" Grayson shook his head, his hands trembling. "You won't believe me. No one ever does. But they're real, and they're not done." Before Martinez could respond, the room seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, colder, and the lights flickered violently. A low hum filled the space, resonating in their bones. Martinez's grip on her weapon tightened as she scanned the room, every nerve in her body on edge. Grayson's face twisted in fear. "It's too late. You've brought them here." The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. Martinez's flashlight flickered, and for a split second, she thought she saw something impossibly tall and thin, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. "Decker, what the—" she began, but her words were drowned out by a sudden crash. The table in front of Grayson toppled over as he dropped to his knees, clutching his head and screaming. Martinez rushed forward, trying to pull him back, but his body went limp in her arms. His breathing was shallow, his eyes unfocused. "Martinez," Decker shouted, "we need to get out of here." But before they could move, the humming stopped. The air felt lighter, the room returning to an uneasy stillness. Grayson's body was still, his face frozen in an expression of terror. Martinez checked his pulse, but there was nothing. He was gone. The aftermath felt surreal. The building was quiet, the strange presence gone as quickly as it had come. Decker looked at Martinez, his face pale. What just happened? Martinez didn't have an answer. She stood, her thoughts spinning as she tried to make sense of it all. Grayson's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, they've always been here, in the shadows asterisk. In the days that followed, the investigation continued. The tapes were reviewed, revealing years of surveillance that corroborated Grayson's claims of trying to protect the children in the neighborhood. But no concrete evidence ever surfaced to explain what had happened in the community center that night. The case of Leila Carter remained unsolved, her disappearance a tragic mystery tied to Grayson's disturbing legacy. Ethan and his family moved away shortly after, unable to shake the lingering fear of what might have been. The neighborhood returned to a semblance of normalcy, but Martinez couldn't forget. She often found herself looking over her shoulder, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. In the end, the truth remained elusive, buried in the shadows where Grayson had claimed it lived. And though the case was officially closed, Martinez couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't really over. Not yet. The days that followed felt like a haze to Martinez. The community center was cordoned off, its haunting silence now broken only by the footsteps of investigators coming every inch for answers. Yet, the deeper they searched, the less they found. There were no physical traces of anything unusual, no evidence to suggest the strange events that unfolded that night were anything more than a collective illusion. The tapes, however, painted a chilling picture. Years of footage chronicled the lives of countless children, all under Grayson's watchful and obsessive eye. But as the recordings were reviewed, one chilling realization emerged. There were no signs of wrongdoing on Grayson's part. Instead, his vigilance appeared almost desperate, as if he genuinely believed he was protecting the children from something no one else could see. Martinez spent hours poring over the tapes herself, looking for anything that might explain the inexplicable. Among the reels, she found a recurring pattern, moments when Grayson's camera lingered on empty spaces, like corners of a yard or darkened windows. At first, it seemed like nothing more than paranoia, but when Martinez watched closely, she noticed subtle distortions in the footage. The image would waver, the colors would fade, and there was that same low hum she had heard in the community center, faint but unmistakable. Decker, too, struggled to move past that night. He avoided talking about it openly, brushing off questions from colleagues and family. But during quieter moments, he confided in Martinez, his voice laced with unease. "I can't stop thinking about what he said. About them. I don't know what we saw, but what if he wasn't crazy? What if he was right?" Martinez didn't have an answer. She wanted to dismiss it, to attribute the strange events to stress or an overactive imagination. But every time she tried to rationalize it, she thought about the fear in Grayson's eyes and the unnatural presence in that room. Something had happened, something she explained, and it gnawed at her more than she cared to admit. Meanwhile, the neighborhood tried to move forward. Grayson's house was sold, its sinister reputation quietly swept aside by a fresh coat of paint and a new family looking for a fresh start. The old community center was officially condemned, its doors permanently sealed. But whispers lingered among the residents, tales of strange sounds at night and fleeting shadows that seemed to watch from the edges of the park. Martinez and Decker continued their work, taking on new cases and immersing themselves in the grind of detective life. Yet, the events of that case stayed with them, an unspoken shadow hanging over their partnership. One evening, months after Grayson's death, Martinez received a package at her office. There was no return address, just her name scrawled in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single VHS tape and a folded piece of paper. The note read, "Asterisk, you're not done yet. Watch carefully asterisk." Her pulse quickened as she placed the tape into an old VCR, the static on the screen giving way to a familiar scene. It was the playground, captured in the same grainy style as Grayson's other recordings. Children played on the swings and slides, their laughter faint but clear. But something was off. In the background, just beyond the edge of the frame, there was movement, subtle at first but unmistakable. A dark figure loomed in the shadows, tall and thin, its presence almost blending into the background. Martinez froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move like a person. Its motions were fluid, almost otherworldly. It stayed just out of focus, watching, waiting. The tape ended abruptly, leaving her staring at a black screen. She immediately called Decker, her voice urgent. "I just got something. Another tape. There's something on it." Decker arrived within the hour, his face pale as he watched the footage. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Martinez admitted, "but it feels like a warning." They reported the tape, but just like with Grayson's collection, no definitive answers emerged. The investigation was closed, the tape logged as evidence, but Martinez couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The question of who, or what, Grayson had been watching still lingered unanswered. Over time, life moved forward, though not entirely unchanged. Martinez found herself paying closer attention to the small details, the way shadows moved in the corner of her vision, the subtle shifts in the air on quiet nights. She couldn't explain it, but she felt as though she had inherited Grayson's watchfulness, his unrelenting need to protect. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a deep instinctual awareness that there were forces in the world that didn't play by the rules of logic or reason. Decker, too, seemed different. He became more guarded, more cautious, his natural skepticism tempered by a lingering unease. Yet, in those rare moments when they spoke openly about that night, he would say, "I don't know what we saw, but I hope we never see it again." Ethan and his family never returned to the neighborhood. They started a new life far from the shadow of Grayson's house, and though they never contacted Martinez directly, she occasionally received updates through mutual acquaintances. Ethan was doing well, his cheerful demeanor slowly returning, though his mother said he still had nightmares. As for Martinez, she found herself drawn back to the case in quiet moments, replaying the events in her mind and searching for meaning. It wasn't just the strange occurrences or the eerie tapes, it was the humanity of it all. Grayson's life had been consumed by his obsession, but underneath it was a tragic, almost heroic intent. He wasn't the monster they had thought he was. He had seen something no one else had, and in his own twisted way, he had tried to protect the innocent. In the end, the story didn't have a neat resolution. There were no definitive answers, no satisfying explanations to tie it all together. But maybe that was the point. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, some truths too vast or terrifying to comprehend fully. As Martinez sat in her quiet apartment one night, staring out the window at the flickering streetlights, she thought about Grayson's final words. Asterisk. "They're not done, asterisk." She didn't know if she believed him, but as she turned off the light and closed her eyes, she found herself whispering a silent promise. Asterisk, if they come back, I'll be watching too, asterisk. And with that, the shadows outside seemed just a little less dark.